All right, good evening. I'm Josh Weis. I'm a fourth-year resident at UT Southwestern, and I'd like to thank SAGES for giving me the opportunity to present this topic, and also all my co-authors who are much more accomplished and important than I am, but are humble enough to let me do the presentation. So I have nothing to disclose. So why should we care about fellowship reform, and particularly about the Advanced GI MIS fellowship? Well, we know from the literature that about 80% of general surgery graduates will go on to pursue a fellowship. And across the country right now and internationally, undergraduate and graduate medical education are being looked at about how to better prepare all of our graduates for practice. And we can't just rely on residency and medical school to take care of this. We need to be keeping up with all of those things and make sure that our fellowships are up to snuff as well. And so fellowship reform is very important, and particularly if you look at the Fellowship Council and the fellowships that they offer, Advanced GI MIS fellowships account for about 60% of the positions available. As you can see here, about 120 out of the 199 fellowship positions offered under the Fellowship Council are Advanced GI MIS accredited programs. And as many of you probably know, SAGES is a major stakeholder in these fellowships in that they define the curriculum for these fellowships, and the Fellowship Council uses those curricula to accredit programs who offer these positions. Also, when fellows graduate from these programs, they can apply to SAGES for a certificate so that they're certified as an Advanced GI MIS surgeon. So as an organization, SAGES cares a lot about these fellowships and making sure that the curriculum are robust and well-defined. So currently, what is the state of Advanced GI MIS fellowship training, and what does it mean to have one of those fellowships? Well, it's 150 complex MIS cases, and this is just a schematic that sort of shows you it can look a lot of different ways. So one fellow may do some foregut, some lap colon and rectal surgery, some lap ventral angle hernias, and then someone across the street who's also a GI MIS fellow can do bariatrics and HPB with a little bit of foregut, still hit their 150 cases and have a widely different experience. And so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to certify both of those individuals and accredit both of those programs as the same type of fellowship, as they graduate with different levels of expertise and different disease processes. And so SAGES leadership recognized this a few years ago, and they said, we need to really better define the core content of what's defined by these fellowships. It shouldn't be just based on MIS techniques, but it needs to be disease-based and focus on what we're using MIS techniques to care for. And we need to move towards entrustable professional activities, just like UME and GME leaders are encouraging us to do with medical schools and residencies. And they also had the goal of modernizing our educational methods, not just counting up to 150 complex cases and saying, great, you're good to go, but saying we need to be more thorough and actually verify that people are competent after they've reached these thresholds. So the SAGES leadership back in March 2016 charged the Resident and Fellow Training, or Raft, committee with developing some new criteria and assessments for the fellowship and then bringing it back to the exec and the board for approval. So a Raft working group was formed, and one of the first things they did was gather some historical case log data from Advanced GI MIS fellows to look at what sorts of cases they do and what sorts of numbers of those cases. So they analyzed data from 2012 through 2015. This was 326 fellows and over 85,000 cases. And they went through in a stepwise fashion. First, they looked at what categories of cases these fellows are often performing, and they came up with these 6. So they do foregut, bariatrics, lap inguinal, lap ventral hernias, flexible endoscopy, and then they created this other sort of catch-all category of hepatobiliary, solid organ, colon and rectal, and thoracic. And they then took all of those fellows and said, well, how many of each of these types of cases are people doing? And they wanted to establish a case log minimum that would be high enough to provide some meaningful exposure to this type of disease-based category, but not so high that a typical fellow was not going to be able to meet those minimums within a year. And so these are the minimums that they came up with and proposed. And when they looked at the data, the percentage of these 3 years of fellows who actually hit these minimums are shown here. And you can see it's about 60 to 80% depending on the category. And again, the Raft thought that's really a good thing, because we're not just trying to set thresholds that everybody's already meeting. We're trying to set thresholds that are meaningful, and that's going to elevate the quality of what these fellowships are doing. So The whole package that they put together is described on the next slides, and it includes those case log minimums. There were 75 defined category cases, 24 gut, 25 bariatric, 10 inguinal, 10 ventral hernia, and 10 of that miscellaneous category. They kept the 150 total complex MIS requirement, so that leaves 75 additional cases that can come from any of these categories. So it still allows for a lot of heterogeneity in our fellowships, but does establish a core of content. And then they define the surgeon role for these cases, much like residency. So within the defined categories, the fellow has to be a primary surgeon or TA in order to get credit for all 75 of these. For the 75 additional, the fellow has to be primary surgeon for at least 50 out of 75. And for the remaining 25, they could be first assistant, and that's acceptable for credit. Additionally, there's a flexible endoscopy requirement, as I mentioned. A fellow has to get 50 upper or lower endoscopies during their year of fellowship. These can be diagnostic or therapeutic, and they can be formed in conjunction with other procedures and still have both count. So for example, if a fellow does an EGD to look at a Raft during a Nissen funduplication, they can log the Nissen and get credit for a foregut case, log the EGD and get credit for an endoscopy. And finally, the video assessment component of the fellowship, and this is the novel assessment method I was referring to earlier, not just counting cases, but actually making some objective measure of whether when a fellow finishes fellowship, he or she is prepared to go out into practice and be a safe surgeon. And the principle is that a fellow will submit unedited video of them performing a laparoscopic funduplication to the Raft committee. They have to be the primary surgeon actually doing it. And the Raft will take it, evaluate the video according to a standardized rubric, and there will be a performance threshold that's necessary for them to get that stamp of approval from the Raft. And this is currently under development with Matt Ritter and the Curriculum Task Force. So some points of discussion about these criteria. Overall, the Raft feels that this set of requirements definitely better defines core content for what these fellowships are in a much more meaningful way than just saying 150 complex MIS cases. This will allow more robust curricula and didactics to be built around them. The case log minimums still allow for a lot of heterogeneity for fellows to customize their experience to areas of interest. And they're not necessarily thresholds for mastery, but they are what we believe are reasonable thresholds for exposure to these disease-based areas. Flexible endoscopy, some have argued, is really the realm of the general surgery residency program, and why is it included in the fellowships? But many general surgery residents might encounter their flex endo as second or third years, and then go on to take their FES exam and not really do much. So by the time they become a fellow, they really need to have some endoscopy in their fellowship and to get used to looking at Nissens, looking at sleeves, and doing some more things applicable to their practice before they go out and do it independently. Finally, this video assessment, as I mentioned, is a novel approach to certifying competency. The methods are still under development, but once it's ready, it will be implemented in the fellowship. In conclusion, these new criteria provide meaningful core content and novel assessment methods for our fellowships. And in this academic year, there are 13 institutions and 16 fellows who are serving as pilot centers for testing the criteria. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.